Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. If you enjoy spine-chilling stories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more eerie tales. Let's dive into tonight's story. When I first moved into the apartment, I didn't think much of the place. It was small, a bit rundown, and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was close to campus and fit within my meager budget. My new roommate, Eric, seemed normal enough. He was quiet, polite, and kept to himself most of the time. At first, we barely interacted. He'd be out when I got home, and I'd usually retreat to my room to study or scroll aimlessly on my phone. When we did talk, it was the typical roommate small talk. How was your day? Or, do you need anything from the store? He wasn't exactly friendly, but he wasn't unfriendly either. The only thing that seemed a little odd was his desk. In his small, sparsely decorated room, the desk was the centerpiece, sturdy, dark wood with a locked drawer at the bottom. I noticed it on the first day when I passed by his room and saw him carefully locking it before heading out. At first, I didn't care. Everyone has their personal belongings, and I wasn't about to snoop. But over time, I couldn't help but notice how often he interacted with that drawer. I'd hear the distinct click of the lock nearly every evening as he closed it. Sometimes I'd see him standing over it, staring at it like he was deep in thought. Once, when I asked him casually what he kept in there, he gave me a tight smile and said, "Just some personal stuff. You know, family papers." Family papers? Who locks up family papers like they're the crown jewels? My curiosity grew. A few weeks later, Eric mentioned he'd be going to visit his parents for a long weekend. He was polite as always, giving me a quick heads up, but I could see a hint of hesitation in his face, like he was worried about leaving. That Friday evening, after he left, I stood in the hallway outside his room, staring at the door. I didn't want to be that roommate. The one who invades privacy, who can't mind their own business. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By Saturday night, I gave in. I told myself it was harmless. Just a quick peek, and I'd lock everything back up exactly the way I found it. He'd never know. I crept into his room, my heart pounding in my chest. His desk was immaculate, everything in its place. But my eyes were drawn immediately to the locked drawer. I fumbled with a screwdriver I'd grabbed from the kitchen, and began working on the lock. It was tougher than I expected, and with each scrape and click, I held my breath, terrified someone might hear. Finally, the lock gave way with a loud pop. I froze, listening for any sounds from the hallway. When I was sure I was still alone, I slowly pulled the drawer open. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. There were a few folders stacked neatly inside, some notebooks, and a couple of loose pens. I let out a nervous laugh. Maybe I'd been overthinking this whole thing. But as I shuffled through the papers, something caught my eye. A plain white envelope tucked at the very bottom. It was sealed but felt slightly thick, like it was stuffed with something. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. My breath hitched as I flipped through them. They were pictures of me. Some were taken from the hallway, capturing me sitting at my desk or watching TV in the living room. Others were more invasive, me sleeping in my bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, completely unaware. I dropped the photos, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. How long had he been doing this? And why? I scrambled to put everything back exactly as I'd found it, relocking the drawer with the screwdriver. My mind raced as I returned to my room, bolting the door behind me. For the rest of the weekend, I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment made my heart race. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, ready to call someone if anything happened. Eric returned Sunday evening. He greeted me with his usual nod and polite smile, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. My stomach churned every time I saw him. I tried to act normal, but I felt like my fear was written all over my face. 2 days later, I found a new place to live. I didn't give him an explanation. I didn't even tell him I was leaving. I packed up my things while he was at work and left the key on the kitchen counter. I'll never know what he was planning or why he had those pictures. But sometimes late at night, I wonder if I was the first person he did that to, or if I was just the latest. When I first moved in with Sarah, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was friendly, kept the apartment clean, and seemed easygoing. Everything you could want in a roommate. The apartment itself wasn't anything special, just a small 2-bedroom on the edge of town, but it was quiet, affordable, and felt safe. At least, it did at first. The late-night noises started about a month after I moved in. I'd always been a light sleeper, so it didn't take much to wake me. At first, it was little things, the creak of the front door, soft footsteps in the kitchen. I assumed it was Sarah coming home late. The thing is, I never actually saw her. Most nights, I'd hear the door open around 2 or 3 a.m., and then footsteps shuffling around the apartment. The sounds would last maybe 15 minutes before everything went silent again. By the time I got up in the morning, Sarah was always asleep in her room. I didn't think much of it at first. She was an adult, her schedule was her business. But as the weeks went on, the noises started to get stranger. One night, I woke up to what sounded like whispering in the living room. It wasn't loud, just soft, hurried murmurs, like someone was having an intense conversation. I couldn't make out any words, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The next morning, I asked Sarah about it. She looked at me, confused. "I wasn't up last night," she said. "I came home around 8 and went straight to bed. Are you sure it wasn't outside?" I nodded, but something about her response didn't sit right with me. A week later, I decided to stay up and catch her in the act. I made some coffee, settled on the couch with a book, and waited. Sure enough, around 2:30 a.m., I heard the front door creak open. My heart pounded as I set down my book and stood up, peeking out from behind the hallway wall. The living room light was off, but the faint glow from the streetlights outside lit the space enough for me to see. A figure moved into the kitchen, tall, slim, with long dark hair. It had to be Sarah. "Sarah!" I called out. The figure froze. "Hey, it's late. Everything okay?" I took a step closer. But before I could reach the kitchen, the figure disappeared around the corner. I hurried after them, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. When I reached the kitchen, it was empty. The back door was locked. The windows were closed. There was no one there. I stood there, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was I sleep-deprived? The next morning, I brought it up with Sarah again. This time, her face went pale. "I haven't been out of my room at night," she said. "Actually, I've been meaning to ask you. Have you been moving things in the kitchen? Sometimes I come in, and the chairs are pulled out or the pantry door is open." I shook my head. "No, I thought it was you." We both laughed nervously, but neither of us really believed it was funny. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. When I first moved in with Chris, everything seemed fine. He was polite, quiet, and a little awkward, but nothing that raised any red flags. The apartment was decent, a small, 2-bedroom unit with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was clean and affordable. For the first few weeks, Chris and I mostly kept to ourselves. He spent a lot of time in his room, and I assumed he was just one of those introverted types who liked their space. We'd exchange polite greetings in the kitchen or living room, but that was about it. Then I started noticing things. It began with his stares. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd look up from my laptop and catch him standing in the doorway, just watching me. He wouldn't say anything, just stand there, his face blank, eyes locked on mine. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked once, forcing a smile. He blinked like I'd snapped him out of a trance, and mumbled something about needing a glass of water before walking away. I brushed it off. Maybe he was just socially awkward. But the staring didn't stop. One night, I was watching TV in the living room when I felt it again. That uncomfortable prickling sensation, like someone's eyes were boring into me. I turned, and there he was, standing just outside the room, half hidden in the shadows. "Chris," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He tilted his head slightly, like he was confused. Then he turned and walked back to his room without a word. After that, I started feeling uneasy in my own home. I'd catch him standing in strange places, staring at me without any expression. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night and found my bedroom door slightly open. I always closed it before going to bed. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just quirky. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The breaking point came one night when I got home late from work. I walked into the apartment and immediately felt off. The lights were off, and the place was eerily quiet. "Chris," I called out, but there was no answer. I went to my room, planning to lock the door and go to bed. But when I opened the door, I froze. Chris was standing in the middle of my room, holding one of my shirts. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, my voice trembling. He stared at me, his expression blank as ever. I needed to borrow something." I didn't wait for an explanation. I grabbed my phone, stepped back into the hallway, and called the landlord. By morning, I had packed my things and was out of the apartment. I don't know what his deal was, and I don't want to know. I just hope I was able to get out before things got worse. When I first moved in with Dana, I thought I had hit the roommate jackpot. She was friendly, outgoing, and kept the apartment clean. The place itself was cozy, a top-floor unit in an older building with lots of charm. It had creaky floors, vintage fixtures, and a closet in the hallway that Dana kept locked. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Everyone has their secrets, and it wasn't my business what she kept in there. But as time went on, I couldn't help but notice how protective she was of it. One day, I accidentally knocked a broom over while cleaning, and it hit the closet door with a loud thud. Dana came rushing out of her room, her face pale. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp. "Yeah, sorry," I said, gesturing to the broom. "Just cleaning." She forced a smile but didn't say anything else. Instead, she stood there for a moment, staring at the closet like she was making sure it was still locked. From then on, I started to notice how often she checked that closet. She'd pause in the hallway, casually placing her hand on the door handle like she was making sure it hadn't been touched. One night, curiosity got the better of me. Dana had mentioned she'd be working late, and I was home alone. As I walked past the closet, I stopped and stared at it. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Just a peek, I thought. The lock was old and looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. I grabbed a paperclip and a small screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and went to work. It took a while, but eventually the lock clicked open. Inside, the closet was dark, and a faint musty smell hit me as I pulled the door open. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just a few boxes and old coats hanging on a rod. But when I crouched down to look inside one of the boxes, my stomach turned. The box was filled with pictures, hundreds of them. They were all of the same man, taken at different times and places. Some were clearly old, faded with time, while others looked newer. I picked up one of the newer pictures, and my breath caught in my throat. The man was sitting on a park bench, reading a book. In the corner of the photo, I recognized Dana's reflection in a storefront window, holding the camera. I flipped through more pictures, and my unease grew. There were shots of him walking down the street, eating at a cafe, standing in line at a grocery store. They all looked candid, like he didn't know he was being photographed. As I reached the bottom of the box, I found a journal. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but I opened it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes about the man, his schedule, the places he frequented, even the names of people he talked to. Suddenly, the sound of keys jingling at the front door snapped me out of my daze. Panicking, I shoved everything back into the box and closed the closet door, relocking it just as Dana walked in. "Hey," she said, smiling. "What's up?" "Not much," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That night, I barely slept. I couldn't stop thinking about the pictures, about the man. Who was he? And why was Dana keeping all of this? The next morning, I told Dana I'd found a new place and would be moving out. She seemed surprised but didn't ask any questions. To this day, I don't know who the man in the pictures was or why Dana was so obsessed with him. But I do know one thing. I'm glad I never asked. When I first moved in with Simon, I thought I was lucky to have found such an affordable place in the city. He was an easygoing guy, always cracking jokes and offering to cook dinner. It seemed like the perfect setup, until the excuses started. At first, it was little things. He'd forget to clean up after himself or accidentally use my shampoo. Annoying, but not a deal breaker. Then, about 2 months into living together, he told me he was short on rent. "I'll pay you back," he said, giving me that boyish grin he always used when he was trying to charm someone. "It's just been a tight month." I agreed. What else could I do? It wasn't like I could cover the whole rent myself, and he promised it was a one-time thing. But it wasn't. The next month, he had another excuse. This time, his hours had been cut at work. The month after that, his car had broken down. Each time, he swore he'd make it up to me, and each time, I found myself covering more and more of the bills. One night, after another argument about money, I decided to look into his story. He'd always said he worked late shifts at a local bar, so I figured I'd stop by after my evening class to see if he was actually there. When I walked into the bar, I scanned the room for Simon, but he wasn't there. I asked the bartender about him, and she gave me a blank look. "Simon? Never heard of him," she said. My stomach sank. When I got home, Simon was sitting on the couch, eating chips and watching TV like nothing was wrong. I confronted him right then and there. "Why did you lie about your job?" I demanded. He looked at me, confused for a moment, then shrugged. What are you talking about? I went to the bar, I said. They've never heard of you. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he sighed and turned off the TV. Okay, fine, he said. I don't work there. But it's not what you think. I've been looking for work. It's just been tough. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about the way he said it didn't feel right. A few weeks later, I noticed small things going missing from my room. At first, it was just loose change from my dresser, but then I couldn't find my favorite earrings or a gift card I'd been saving. I confronted Simon again, but he denied everything. Why would I steal from you? He said, looking genuinely offended. That weekend, I decided to do some snooping of my own. While Simon was out, I went into his room. I felt bad about it, invading his privacy, but I needed to know the truth. What I found shocked me. Tucked under his bed was a shoebox filled with cash, small electronics, and what looked like random trinkets. My earrings were in there, along with the gift card and a handful of other things I didn't recognize. When Simon came home, I was waiting for him in the living room, the shoebox on the coffee table in front of me. What the hell is this? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. For the first time, he didn't have an excuse. He just stood there, staring at the box, his face pale. I needed the money, he finally said. I didn't wait for him to explain. I told him to pack his things and get out. Looking back, I can't believe I didn't see the signs sooner. Simon seemed like the perfect roommate at first, but in the end, he was just another con artist. When I first moved into the apartment with Wendy, I thought we'd get along fine. She was quiet, tidy, and seemed easygoing. But it didn't take long before I started finding the notes. They were little yellow sticky notes left in the kitchen, on the bathroom mirror, or even on my bedroom door. Please clean up after yourself. Thanks. Don't forget to turn off the lights when you leave a room. At least try to wash your dishes the same day, okay? At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has their quirks, and if writing notes was her way of communicating, so be it. I tried to follow her rules as best as I could, but the notes kept coming. Soon they became more specific and more personal. I know it was you who ate my yogurt. Buy me a new one. Maybe try wearing headphones after 10 p.m.? Just a thought. Are you really incapable of folding your laundry immediately? I hadn't eaten her yogurt or left my laundry out, but I didn't argue. It felt easier to just let it slide. But then the notes got weird. One morning, I found a note on my pillow. I hear you walking around at night. It's creepy. Stop. I didn't know how to respond to that. I wasn't walking around at night. I'd been asleep. Another time, I found a note in the bathroom. Do you really have to take such long showers? Water isn't free, you know. I started feeling like I was being watched all the time. I'd catch Wendy glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, but when I tried to talk to her about it, she acted like everything was normal. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find a note taped to my bedroom door. You need to move out. This isn't working. That was it. No explanation, no conversation, just a demand. I stormed into her room, ready to confront her, but she wasn't there. Her bed was perfectly made, her desk neatly organized, and her closet half empty, as if she hadn't fully unpacked. Confused, I sat on the couch to wait for her, but as the hours passed, it became clear she wasn't coming back. The next morning, I called the landlord to ask if he'd heard from her. That's when he told me something I'll never forget. Wendy. There's no Wendy on the lease, he said. You're the only tenant listed. I had been looking for a place to stay for months when I finally found an apartment to share with Felon. She was in her late 20s, friendly, and seemed to be an ideal roommate. She worked a 9-to-5 job, kept her space clean, and always offered to help with the rent. The apartment was a little rundown, but it had charm. Exposed brick walls, a small kitchen, and large windows that let in tons of light. At first, everything was great. We'd chat over coffee in the mornings, and our schedules never really clashed. It wasn't until a few weeks into living there that I started to notice something odd. Late at night, I could hear strange music drifting through the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be intrusive, but it was off. The songs were slow, eerie, with a kind of haunting quality to them. I asked Felon about it one morning. "Oh, that," she said with a casual shrug. "It's just some ambient music I listen to when I'm winding down. It helps me sleep. I didn't think much of it at first, but the more I heard it, the more uneasy it made me feel. It wasn't like any music I'd ever heard before. There were no lyrics, just long, drawn-out melodies that seemed to repeat, almost like a lullaby. Then one night, I woke up to find the music blaring from Felon's room. I could tell it wasn't ambient anymore. It was louder, more frantic, and it sounded as if someone was whispering. The sound was unsettling, but I figured Felon must have left her music on by accident. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I opened it slightly, but the room was empty. Felon's bed was made, and everything looked normal, except for the music that seemed to be coming from the stereo on her desk. I was about to turn it off when I saw something on her desk, a notebook. It was covered in strange, cryptic symbols. I couldn't help myself. I flipped it open. Inside, the pages were filled with odd, repetitive phrases like, "I am here, don't wake me," and "the music will guide you." My heart started racing, but I couldn't stop reading. As I turned the page, there was a detailed drawing of the apartment, with XS marked on various locations, including my room. It was like Felon had been keeping track of every movement I made. Suddenly, the music stopped, and Felon appeared in the doorway. "Sorry," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't realize it was so loud. It's just my playlist. Helps me focus." I stared at her, not knowing whether to be scared or confused. The next day, I packed up my things and left without saying a word. I never found out what Felon was really up to, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be sticking around to find out. I had been living in the apartment with Kyle for about 3 months when I noticed something strange. I moved in at the start of summer, and at first, everything seemed fine. Kyle was a quiet guy, a little withdrawn, but that was fine with me. He was polite, paid his rent on time, and kept to himself, which suited my introverted personality perfectly. But then, one evening, I walked in after work and found a strange suitcase sitting by the door. I had never seen it before. It was old, worn down, and had a faded tag with a name written in faded black ink. Jason M. I looked at Kyle, who was sitting at the kitchen table reading a book. "Hey, whose suitcase is that?" I asked casually. "Oh, that." Kyle replied, not looking up from his book. "It's Jason's. He left it here a while ago, and never came back to get it." I furrowed my brow. "Jason? Who's Jason?" Kyle paused for a moment and then shrugged. "Just a guy I used to room with. He moved out a few months ago, remember?" I stared at him for a moment. I was certain I didn't remember anyone named Jason. I had only ever met Kyle when I moved in, and Kyle had always been living here alone, or so I thought. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I had forgotten, or maybe he was just a previous roommate Kyle never mentioned. Over the next few weeks, the suitcase remained there by the door, gathering dust. I never mentioned it again, but every time I saw it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, one evening, I came home to find Kyle in the living room, his face pale and his eyes wide. He looked shaken. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, dropping my keys on the counter. Kyle didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting to the suitcase and back to me. "We need to talk." I sat down across from him. "What's going on, Kyle?" He looked like he was struggling to find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "There's no Jason." I blinked. "What? What do you mean?" Kyle took a deep breath. "I made him up. There was never anyone named Jason. I don't know why I said that to you. I guess I wanted to avoid the truth." I sat back, completely confused. "So, who left that suitcase here?" Kyle looked at me with wide, almost frantic eyes. "I don't know. I don't remember. But there's something wrong. Something bad happened in this apartment before you moved in." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Kyle hesitated, his voice trembling. "I used to live here with another roommate. His name wasn't Jason, though. It was Mark. He disappeared, and I don't remember what happened to him." I stared at him in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. "Kyle, you're scaring me." Kyle stood up suddenly, shaking his head. "I need to go. I need to leave this place." He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, leaving me standing there, frozen in place. I didn't see Kyle for the next few days. I tried to reach him, but his phone was disconnected, and he never returned any of my messages. It wasn't until I opened the door to his room that I understood. It was exactly the same as the first time I walked in. The bed was made, his belongings were neatly packed away, and there was no sign of a struggle or anything unusual. But in the corner of the room, there was a small notebook. I picked it up, curious to see what was inside. The pages were filled with jumbled notes, sketches of rooms, and odd phrases. One of them stood out. "He's still here. The one who never left." I left the room immediately, the book still in my hand, and never looked back. I moved out of the apartment the next day. I didn't want to know what Kyle had been running from or what had really happened to his former roommate. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. And every now and then, when I close my eyes at night, I swear I can hear footsteps from the empty room down the hall.